Buzz Killers, it's one thing to study presidential elections. It's another thing to study the chronological history of a certain period. But it's yet another thing, and a very important thing to study, to try to put those things in very much the full context in which they happen, and to talk about all the other things that were going on at the time. And fortunately for you, we have with us on the line via the internet Scott Martelle, whose new book, 1932, FDR, Hoover, and the Dawn of a New America, does just that, and it is out today. Today is the release date for the book. Scott, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me on.
As I was reading the book, and then as you and I have talked about this, I was really amazed at how many things happened during 1932 and how many things happened that I thought had happened in 29 or 1930, 1931. In fact, I may have told my students that, and it's just not true. It's almost as if 1932 becomes an intensification of everything that had happened since the Wall Street crash in 29. Am I exaggerating?
No, I think you've just nailed it perfectly. That's a very, very good way of summing it up. Because a lot of the stuff that I write about 1932 did indeed start prior to that, like the bank failures and those types of things. But they all were crescendoing or peaking in 1932.
Why do you think that happened? I mean, it's probably too much to say, people were gearing up for the election, so they decided to have more protest marches and things like that. But it does seem to be almost like a switch was flipped.
Yeah, because conditions were getting worse. The spiral was continuing downward. And so response to that was picking up pace. The farmers, especially in Iowa and across the Midwest, who did their farmers' holiday, they've been sort of chomping at the bit for several years at that point, hoping to get some sort of policy change out of Washington. And they were kind of sort of playing it slow through the election, up to the election, hoping to get some sort of change.
Now, what was the farmers' holiday? I mean, I know because I read the book, and I know because I know, but most people don't know. Most people think of the of the crash and stuff as a very much Wall Street thing that only gradually affected people in the other parts of the country. The farmers' holiday is something that's been going on for a while, or plans for it.
Yeah, the farmers had been in trouble economically since shortly after World War I. They were doing a lot of exports to Europe during the war. A lot of them got overextended during the war, shortly after the war. Prices were low in the late 20s. And with the onset of the Depression, the bottom fell out. So these folks couldn't make a profit at what the market price was for, say, corn. And they were increasingly frustrated with a lack of policy response out of Washington, in this case, Republicans, Hoover and the Republican-led Congress. But they weren't too pleased with the Democrats either. I mean, they got the sense that nobody really cared about what was happening, in the hinterlands. So we see echoes of that today with the sort of the rural mindset against Washington and East Coast liberals. But whenever banks were facing trouble or running their money in that era, they would declare a holiday and just shut their doors. So depositors couldn't get their money. And the farmers began thinking, well, if they can declare a holiday, we can declare a holiday. So it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek way of saying they're going on strike. So they decided to hold their goods to the market. Like any good strike, to enforce it, they set up picket lines. They were blockading small market towns in Iowa. There were blockades outside of Iowa City as well. It was occasionally violent, fairly effective in drawing attention to what was going on. Not very effective as a boycott kind of process. The people are still getting food, and the agricultural marketers were still finding a way to get products from other places. But it got nationwide coverage in the newspapers and on the radio, and really brought to the fore the problems that the farmers were facing. And that's something that Franklin Roosevelt, then the governor of New York and candidate for president in 1932, really drilled down on in his public speeches. The interconnections between the farmers who can't make a living and the poor people in the cities, the industrial workers who have been put out of work. They couldn't buy food. So he saw all of the economic problems in the country interconnected that way. And that was the message he was trying to push.
Yeah, and I sometimes wonder, just to keep pushing this point a little more, we understand why industrial workers go on strike, and we understand that industrial workers can go on strike because it's easy. One of the reasons it's easy to organize them, that they're all together, they're all in one place, sort of. How do disparate farmers spread out across huge expanses of land, organize themselves into a strike?
There were associations out there. Milo Reno was one of the leaders of one of them. There was sort of like, I don't know how to describe it, kind of like an early era NGO. They were working together for mutual benefit, lobbying Washington, lobbying state capitals. You're right. Farmers then and now are fairly independent folks. But when they needed to, historically, they band together. Rural populism has been a big thing for generations.
Well, you said a second ago this didn't have much effect because people were able to get food from other sources, merchants and shopkeepers could be able to get food from other sources. But it did have a galvanizing effect on farmers and rural people, if you will, as a political community coming up to the election year. Is that right?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. It was very much a way to focus their energies, to put pressure on certain points to try to get some sort of results. They didn't get much of what they were hoping for over long term, but it did, bring their needs and their issues to the public fore. And one of the fun ones is a farm would be foreclosed upon. And word would go out that everybody goes to the sale, right?
Yeah.
But nobody bids on anything. We've got a few people set up, we're going to do all the bidding, and they're going to lowball everything. So the bankers and the creditors who thought they were going to get, X amount of money out of the sale of this thing would get pennies. And in a lot of cases, the farmers who bought the stuff, the auction, would turn around and give it back to the owner that it had been taken from.
Mm.
So that this sort of took all the power out of an auction and out of a foreclosure process.
Now, we're going on and on about this, Buzzkillers, because as Scott says, that FDR is able to sort of unite the farmers and the urban workers in the election of 1932. But also, there's nothing to indicate up until this point that the farmers were heavily behind the Democratic Party anyway. From large sections of the northern Midwest is heavily Republican traditionally.
Right. Yeah, it's true. In the South, they tended to be Democratic, but very conservative Democrats.
Mm.
So when they voted Democrat, it was more legacy votes than policy votes. They had a very conservative lot, and it was interesting that the crux of this rebellion by the farmers was in Iowa, which is where Hoover came from.
Yeah.
And he swept the state in his 1928 election, his first run for the president.
That is amazing. Now, we need to get on to the actual year itself, because as you say, all this stuff has been going on since 29 and even before. But if this year really is a sort of crucible of all these challenges and all these issues being boiled in the one sort of crucible, how does the year? Well, sorry. Let me ask it this way, because I was introduced to someone in this book I'd never heard of before, and that was Father Cox, a man who
interesting figure,
runs for president, and he has a huge march in January. So let's start off with Father Cox, this person again no one's ever heard of. Now,
if you're from Pittsburgh, you've heard of
well,
him.
yeah,
yeah, you're right. Otherwise, it's sort of a forgotten figure. He was a priest in a parish just outside of the downtown area of Pittsburgh, kind of the working class, poor area of the city at the time. And he already had a soup kitchen, already had some good public works. He came up from a working class background himself. He was kind of apolitical, but hated communists, hated the whole notion of communism, in no small part probably because of its rejection of religion. And there were some marches in Washington organized by the Communist Party, hunger marches and jobless marches. And it really ticked him off because he thought these were issues that really needed to be pushed and people really need to be helped. But he thought the messenger was wrong.
Yeah.
So he sort of artfully, in a radio interview, said that if the call came for him to organize a march, he would do it. And of course, calls came because he invited them. And in a matter of weeks, he organized what he thought was going to be a few hundred people into several thousand people. And they called it a march, but really was kind of a parade caravan thing. They were taking cars and trucks and all that. And they went from Pittsburgh through Pennsylvania, Maryland, into Washington, and eventually delivered kind of a statement demand to the White House and to the Capitol. And then he didn't get any satisfaction out of those meetings, so he came back to Pittsburgh and declared he's going to run for president and formed his own political party.
Now, you've got to tell us, you've got to tell the listeners the name of the political party. It's a fascinating name. Again, I had never heard this.
It was the Jobless Party.
The Jobless Party, yes.
Perfect jobless, yeah. He was representing all the people who wanted work and couldn't get work. And so we figured, call them the Jobless Party.
Well, the other thing that intrigued me about the beginning of the year, well, first of all, the beginning of the year, there are a lot of these marches and protests and demonstrations. But also what seems to be happening is, as we go through February and March, of course, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, has already declared to run for the presidency. Hoover says he's going to run for the presidency. But I was surprised at how much work FDR puts in the early part of the campaign, building up, for instance, his brain trust of policy advisors, as if he's already been elected. It's like, he's preparing his administration, even technically, I think, I'm going to get the dates right here, technically before the actual nomination by the party, which doesn't happen until June. Already in March, he's organizing a brain trust. That's astounding to me.
Yeah, it was really prescient. Nobody has ever gotten very far by underestimating FDR's political acumen. But while he was governor of New York, he liked to rely on experts to explain things to him that are outside of his previous sphere of knowledge. And one of his aides recommended to him that instead of going to the usual advisors like Wall Street, financiers, people like that, they should go to academics, which in fact FDR had already been doing quite a bit. But this sort of coalesced into a main body of folks who would advise FDR on what policies would be best to try to, sort of wrap their hands around the Depression and come up with different solutions for different things. What's kind of intriguing about FDR is that he was a Democrat, but he wasn't really, dogmatic about things. He wanted to fix things. And as I mentioned in the book, he wasn't really selling policy. He was selling himself as a solution. And that's where the brain trust came out, saying, this is the problem. What do you experts advise I do to address this problem? So even while he had, as you pointed out, he had yet to win the nomination, he already had these policies that were, being argued about and crystallized. Some of them didn't even come to the fore until after his inauguration. But but you're right, he was using this time to sort of build his people.
And we should tell everyone, that being governor of New York back then was a huge deal. It was almost like being the second president because New York was such a big and important state, and and running it was an extremely difficult. So being governor of New York was a very, very good training ground for being president. In fact, it was very common for presidential candidates to spring from governorships, which they don't seem to do so much anymore.
It was especially important in New York because that was the largest state in the country.
Right.
So whoever became governor was de facto a possible presidential contender.
Right. More electoral college votes and everything. But you show how, as all this sort of high-level political stuff is going on, there are these there's a hunger march in Detroit in March. There's in fact, people are killed during it. There's the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform starts meeting in Washington trying to repeal prohibition in April. These, it's a dynamic political year well before the election. And I always think of presidential elections before World War II anyway, not really starting till the end, at least the second half of the year. But here, all this political agitation and looking forward to what a new administration could bring really starts very early. I was very surprised about that.
I'm sure many of your buzzkillers know, but back in that era, political party primaries at the state level didn't really matter that much. Most of the delegates were selected by the party bosses in different states. So like now, people are running 2-3 years out for the presidency because they're trying to line up primary support and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Back then it was more organizational based.
Yeah. Yet the country is agitating on all sorts of issues all across the country.
Yeah, there were. You mentioned other marches came to the fore. There was the bonus marches that began among veterans in Portland, Oregon. Congress had passed years before a bonus bill to sort of make World War I veterans who served overseas more economically up to speed with the folks who stayed home. But to get it passed politically, there was a due date of sometime in 1945. So you had these hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of veterans who needed the money at that moment. And a few of them in Portland, Oregon, Walter Waters was the leader of them, began saying, everybody else is marching in Washington. We should march in Washington too. And so that, again, this began as one of those things with a few dozen people, a couple hundred people, that just snowballed. These guys didn't even pick up media coverage until they're halfway across the country. So it was like, from out of left field. And suddenly there were 20,000 people, veterans, camped out on the streets of Washington, D.C.
Now, when veterans march, that's a really big. That really shows that the country and veterans are demanding something of the government. That really shows that people are hurting because veterans, well, not traditionally, but they're not the most radical firebrand agitators out there, generally speaking. So for them to go on all these marches over all these years is really quite astounding.
Yeah, and especially when you match it up against what the farmers are doing as well. Another group that isn't known for radical actions and taking massive steps to try to achieve change.
I want to get back to the the two-party conventions in a minute. The veterans marches, the bonus marchers and everything arrive in Washington and they camp out. Then something happens and Hoover does something that is actually one of the things that probably hurt him tremendously in public opinion, to try to control those marchers and campers in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, there were flashes of violence between the veterans and police. Police were trying to oust them from buildings they were squatting in. And that sort of put the fear of communism in the White House, and General MacArthur was in charge of the Army forces in the D.C. area at the time. So Hoover finally ordered the federal troops in to remove all the veterans from the property in the city in itself. There was a huge encampment across the Anacostia River. And he didn't envision the Army going to do anything there, just clean out the folks who were directly around the Capitol. But MacArthur saw a communist rebellion foment and sent his folks across the bridge, and they roasted the veterans, thousands of veterans in this Anacostia Flats, and burned down the encampment that they had there. It was a huge publicity disaster for Hoover. And here you had active duty Army folks physically, violently roasting retired Army folks, veterans, for exercising their First Amendment right to speech and assembly. If Hoover had any chance of re-election at that point, he lost it with that act.
Yeah, that's not surprising at all. And this is really the first time that MacArthur appears on the national stage. He becomes very famous in World War II, but this is not a great way to start your PR campaign, because, of course, MacArthur much later has presidential ambitions. This is not a great way to start building a public image or building your brand, as they would say now.
Right. And interestingly, one of his top aides was Eisenhower.
That sort of tells us what's going on with all the veterans, and that's absolutely fascinating. How did the political conventions start? First of all, I was again astounded to find out that they take place in Chicago Stadium. Both of them hold their political conventions there 2 weeks apart or something like that. How were those sort of received by the country? How were they reported? What did people think? Were there anti-Hoover protests at the Republican convention or anything like that?
No, it was actually a very low-key thing, because there was no real opposition to Hoover. So it was kind of like
no opposition within the Republican Party.
Right, yeah. No, there was no challenger for the throne, so to speak. And the media coverage of the convention made it sound like a pretty dour thing.
Yeah.
There was not much excitement. Everybody saw the handwriting on the wall. The general feeling among Republicans and among Democratic political leaders is that whoever got the Democratic nomination was likely going to be president. So there's just this cloud hanging over the convention. Now, on the Democratic side, it was a real street fight, figuratively speaking. Al Smith was sort of waiting in the wings. FDR did not have enough delegates to win in the first vote, so went to, I think, 4 ballots by the time he got it. And there was a lot of maneuvering going on, a lot of finagling.
Yeah, and we remind Buzzkillers, this is not unusual. The way conventions are now, it's already been decided, and then they're frankly boring as hell. Back then, usually they weren't decided. There was often clearly a front runner. Well, Chicago is a famous place for conventions in 1968, but that's another story.
Right.
So then, how does the campaign kind of begin? The traditional view, I think, is that Hoover just sort of tries to project himself as a manager. He doesn't go out and campaign vigorously, where FDR does go out and campaign and also gives talks and also tries to show himself as a reformer in very strong ways. But you show that there's so much more going on in campaigning terms.
Yeah, Hoover didn't like to campaign. Yeah. He was never very good at it, very stiff. He thought it was beneath the dignity of the office to go out and campaign for re-election, and was quickly disabused of that and wound up making a few train trips himself. But FDR just loved the retail part of politics.
Yeah.
And one of the problems he faced was the perception. Everybody knew that he had suffered from polio. Everybody knew that he was suffering from physical disability as a result of that. Not everybody knew how disabled he was. An issue was his stamina. And so he thought it was important to get out there and show that, he did have the strength to carry the fight. And at the same time, he said he was going to say this a lot these days, he's going and listening to it.
Yeah.
So he'd go out and he'd give speeches. So he'd do like a speech in Detroit, say. But he'd make a couple of dozen whistle-stop tours at train stations along the way, spend a minute or two talking to the folks on the platform, but also invite local political folks on the train, and they'd ride with him till the next stop or a couple stops later. So while he's doing these things and getting publicity and speaking to voters, He's also really working hard to build the party infrastructure, because that's what really matters in getting out the vote on election day.
Yeah, and as you say, it's one of the things that actually does happen. The vote does get out for the Democrats. What's the response from the various constituencies that you talk about in the book to this, frankly, very, well, not polarized, but two very different candidates? Granted, both establishment figures, one a politician, one not a politician, but still each having very different ideas about how the economy should be A, fixed, and B, managed from there on. What do these farmers we talked about in the beginning, what do the veterans we talked about, what do they think of the two candidates?
They were kind of skeptical because they'd learned to be skeptical of government and politicians. They kind of were, I mean, they'd given up on Hoover, clearly.
Yeah, yeah.
And they were kind of hopeful they might be able to get something from FDR and the Democrats. But it was sort of we'll go with this guy, and then we'll see what happens. Not a whole lot of enthusiasm among those folks.
Why not? It seems to me that if you're a bonus marcher, it seems to me that if you're a farmer was participating in this strike, the farmers' holiday, you would automatically be an FDR guy. But apparently that it wasn't it certainly wasn't as black and white as that. People are always more sophisticated than we think they are. The general public, political thinking. But I would have thought almost everybody would have jumped to FDR and shouted to the world about it.
What you're getting at is political enthusiasm.
Mm-hmm.
So just because folks are saying, yeah, we're going to back FDR doesn't mean they're going to go out and wave signs and we love him, he's our guy kind of stuff. Yeah. It was more like turning their backs on Hoover and let's go in a new direction. Let's do something different. Remember, FDR wasn't really pushing, by the election day, he was pushing the set policies. But when he first began getting the support and that sort of wave began, it was sort of the personality politics. It didn't hurt that he shared the same last name with Teddy,
right,
who remained a very popular figure in the country. But yeah, it's enthusiasm. Enthusiasm is important, and this was a nation that at the time was incredibly beaten down. It was like, all right, there's an exit. Let's go through that door.
Yeah, and the non-Hoover exit.
Yeah, yeah.
Did you say? And by the way, we'll get to this in more detail in a minute because you did a lot of work with personal diaries and personal correspondence. So this is really a history from the ground level. But did you notice a lot of skepticism of FDR because he's elite and he's what in America passes for an aristocrat? There are farmers in Iowa say, well, wait a minute now. This guy with his fancy pince-nez glasses and his fancy Harvard accent, he doesn't really care about us. He's just saying that.
I didn't get a whole lot of that. Mm-hmm. People, because they were just anxious for change. And FDR did a really good job of making like he was a common person. Mm-hmm. And his family owned a farm along the Hudson. Yeah. And so he's in the South, he would talk, farmer to farmer. These are the issues that we're facing. Never mind that he never actually farmed it himself. Yeah, right. But, he could at least he was at least conversant with the terminology. It was just his power of personality. You had Hoover pushing policies. Yes, we know the country is hurting. We know you're starving. It's a community level problem. This isn't the federal government's problem. And then flip that to FDR saying, the Republicans have driven the country off the bridge. They're helping Wall Street. They're not helping the average guy. The forgotten man was a recurring theme in it. You all are the forgotten man. So it was kind of, rank populism at one level, but it was the power of personality, the cult of personality.
Yeah, yeah.
People were voting for FDR rather than voting for a Democratic slate of policies.
Yeah. Well, then tell us what happens. Tell us what happens election night.
He wins.
Well, okay, yeah, but this is radio. This is podcasting. We have to elaborate.
It was a landslide.
Yeah.
Hoover had beaten Smith in 1928 by a massive landslide, and this time he lost by an even worse landslide.
Yeah.
It was all over. Before the first vote was cast, everybody sort of knew that it was over. Hoover's advisor, his publicity guy in the White House, and a newspaper columnist who was friendly to him, Mark Sullivan, late in the day, began writing up the message that he was going to send to FDR that night. Because even before the polls were closed on the East Coast, they knew he was gone.
Yeah.
Roosevelt's people were meeting at a hotel in New York. And there it was just kind of just waiting for the finalities. Like everybody knew what had happened, that they had won, but they had to wait for the final numbers to come in.
Now, what also astounds me is that it's not, well, maybe this doesn't astound me because it would be too much to expect this to happen, but there isn't, after FDR wins, there isn't a huge sigh of relief in the country. There isn't a sort of, oh, well, everything's probably going to be better because everything's going to change. Well, you show throughout November, December, the banking conditions continue to deteriorate. In fact, early in January and February, banks in the Midwest, their depositors make runs on the bank, and on and on and on. There seems to be too late to calm people just by a presidential election. That's how bad conditions really were.
Yeah, they continued to spiral. Like you mentioned, the banking crisis. One of the first things FDR would do in 1933 was to declare a national bank holiday
Yeah.
to try to get the legs back underneath the system. But in Europe, Hitler was on the rise. It would be a few months after the election that he wound up taking over Germany. Japan was cementing control of portions of Manchuria. So all you could see in the rearview mirror, you can see all these lines coming together that would lead to the massive war that rolled over the world in the beginning of the late 30s. But yeah, the election didn't do anything. Some people felt optimistic that things were going to change, but things weren't changing at that point. And there was an interesting bit. This is pre-polling days, but a marketer, had done a poll for Hoover, did it on the QT. There was no announcement of it, no results were released. But he found that people who were switching their support from Hoover to FDR generally thought that the economy was improving.
Mm-hmm.
These are Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
And they went to FDR primarily over the prohibition issue. Hoover was solidly for prohibition. FDR and the Democrats were for repeal. And that was, at least among that cohort of folks, that was the issue that moved the needle, was an end to prohibition. And we all look at it within the framework of the economy, which of course was a huge factor, but the social issue of prohibition was a major one also.
Yeah. We haven't had time to talk about that. But another thing that astounded me was the extent to which Hoover didn't stop working and didn't stop pursuing his ideas of the government's role in fixing all this. You state, but both in the beginning of the book and at the end of the book, where you talk about this period, Hoover's sending messages to Roosevelt. We should work together on these ideas. I think we should blah 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 blah. Still pushing his policy of less government action, as if he wants to have a sort of, I don't know, coalition government during the transition. And by the way, people didn't say transition back then between presidential administrations. But that seems to me that's never happened before. Certainly hasn't happened since, I don't think. He really, to his marrow, Hoover, believed that his free market solutions were going to work if they just implemented them in the right way.
And just as significant as he was afraid that the stuff that he believed Roosevelt was going to do was going to make everything even worse.
Yeah.
So what he was trying to do was to lock in, especially with the banking crisis. He tried to get Roosevelt to join him in a joint statement pledging there's a balanced federal budget and these other policy issues that Hoover wanted and that FDR spurned. So FDR said flat out, no, this is, we take over March 4th. This is your country until then. And so he just stayed out of it and let Hoover sort of twist in the wind. It's interesting that Hoover was even signing bills in the Capitol within an hour or so of the turnover, the inauguration.
Wow.
So to the end, he was working and stuff.
Yeah, that really, really is amazing. Now, I mentioned a minute ago that you had done a lot of work with diaries and letters and personal reminiscences or personal accounts of what was going on, and this is something that usually doesn't show up in popular accounts of this year and in popular accounts of this period. What was that like? And by the way, you did this during COVID, or at least a lot of it during COVID, so that must have been very difficult to get at these archives and things like that. But give us a flavor of what it was like, reading the diary entries of real people who were living through this stuff at the time.
It was really interesting. I got entries from people with different spots around the country that drew from like 6 people. And finding those diaries actually was fairly easy in this internet age because you can find what's in the archives through their online catalogs and all that. So COVID really didn't interfere with that. It wreaked havoc on my researching Hoover and FDR, but didn't do much.
Oh, okay. Yeah. But were the diaries themselves digitized and put online too, or did you have to go see them?
The ones I used were digitized. So during COVID, as a strategic decision, I figured, okay, I'll go after the diaries because I can do that remotely.
Right.
And it worked out. But it's fascinating because the excerpts I picked were only just a small sliver of these journals.
Yeah.
So I was looking for diaries. I was looking for diaries from people who were talking in some detail about their daily lives, but also occasionally talked about political happenings and the economic happenings. So I read, I don't know how many hundreds and hundreds of pages of different diaries to find the ones that finally made it in the book.
And what Well, you got different senses from different people in different situations. But what were some of those senses that you got? How did they help bring the dry history, if you will? I hate that phrase, but the dry history will to life.
What intrigued me about it was these folks writing about their daily existence.
Yeah.
There's a woman in Utah, active in the Mormon church, and she's married to a doctor, and his business is having a lot of troubles. And she talks about, her children or relatives, adult children, relatives coming to visit, and they bring reports that, so and so hardware has shut its doors, and the bank and this other place is closed, and we're going to get snow tonight. And the daughters went down to see some movie. So
Yeah.
I like just getting that intersection of the big scale stuff with daily life goes on for people.
Yeah, I think that's so important to see that because, when we have the CNN version of history or the History Channel version of history, it really is just the highlights. It's like a sports highlight reel. And people don't realize that even though on the day of the stock market crash, everybody still had to do all of their regular things. On the day of the 1932 election, everybody had to do the regular things. And young people are more interested in going to the movies anyway.
That's what I was going for, is a book that would provide sort of a slice of life over the course of the year in the U.S. And we haven't mentioned it yet, but I also dropped in newsreel type things.
Yes, right, yeah.
Yeah, like the Lindbergh baby kidnapping was that year as well. And that's a whole different book.
Yeah.
You really can't ignore it. So I stole these two devices from John Dos Passos' USA trilogy,
which we recommend highly, Buzzkillers.
Oh yeah, it's a wonderful, wonderful set of novels. But he used that to sort of, do the backdrop to what's going on in the novel he was writing, the stories that he was creating. But that would be a good way of broadening even further the everyday life things that I was trying to do. So I could bring in more background stuff to the reader's attention without having to, put it into the narrative and really draw people down too many cul-de-sacs.
Well, it's just a great book. It's a great read. You're obviously a veteran journalist. This is your 7th book, if I'm not mistaken, of history and political life and current affairs and all that sort of thing. By the way, Buzzkillers, you can't see in the Zoom interview we're having, Scott, it's in his office, in the background of his office. He's got a sort of a coat rack, but it has all his press passes on it. And, and there look like hundreds of them. So you've clearly been on the ground doing tons of work, and we're so glad that you were able to take time to come on the show. So thank you very much.
I deeply appreciate being asked. I appreciate the interest and the kind words.
Oh, thanks. And the book is on the Buzzkill bookshelf, as it always is, 1932, FDR Hoover and the Dawn of a New America. So Buzzkillers, please go get it, and we will talk to all of you next week.